Good evening, Mr. Higgins. We're here to do the CRM final project tonight. Hope you're safe and healthy during this pandemic and everything's going well. So today it's gonna be me. I'm Tyler. It's gonna be Cameron, Aiden, Mark, Steven, and Nicholas as well. So let's get started. I'm gonna start with Cameron. Go ahead and take it away, Cameron.
All right, so we're going to be talking about Alaska 261. This is a scheduled flight departing from Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, heading to Seattle, Washington, with a stop in San Francisco. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas MD-83. The total of 88 people on board, which included 5 crew and 83 passengers. Crew was Captain Edward, also known as Ted Thompson, who was 53 years old, and First Officer William Tansky, who was 57. Just talking about the first segment of the flight, they're cruising at flight level 310, and the crew noticed a jam horizontal stabilizer. So they contacted their maintenance in Washington and told them that they were going to divert to LAX. Because of this, they were unable to trim the aircraft, and both pilots were required to pull about 10 pounds of pressure to stay level. During this, when they were contacting company tried to convince them to continue to San Francisco instead of diverting to LAX. But in this case, the crew disagreed because of the situation that they were in. So as they were cruising along, crew successfully unjammed the stabilizer, but once it freed, the aircraft went into an extreme nose-down attitude. Both pilots were pulling with 130 to 140 pounds of back pressure to stop the 6,000 foot per minute dive, and were able to get it stable at flight level 240. In this case, they contacted air traffic control, discussed the situation that they were having. And then about 10 minutes later, the CVR recorded at least 4 loud thumps and followed by a loud bang after that. Presumably this was the jack screw assembly failing completely. And then this forced the aircraft back into a nosedive. And then both pilots tried to recover the aircraft in the same way they did before, but were unable to. The aircraft just continued in the nosedive. So they tried rolling the aircraft inverted to hopefully buy a little bit more time. But unfortunately, this being unsuccessful, the aircraft crashed into the ocean about 14 miles off Port Hueneme in California. And unfortunately, there was no survivors in this case. I'll pass it over to Tyler to talk about the captain of the crew.
So as Cameron mentioned earlier, the captain was Ted Thompson, this 53-year-old man. He used to fly in the military, so that's part of the reason why he was so tough and wanted to get this airplane hopefully to LA. Obviously that didn't happen. He had 17,500 hours of total time, which is a lot of hours. 4,000 of those hours and more were in MD-80s. Before the crash, Thompson had never been involved in an accident or incident, and that just shows to show you his attitude towards trying to get the aircraft to LAX safely. What I noticed after doing research and reading through the CVR, Ted used phenomenal CRM throughout the flight, in my opinion. Throughout most of the flight, he asked the FO for his opinions on what we should do during the situation, and they had proper communication. There was a time where Ted couldn't understand the first officer's handwriting, so he was just like, hey, can't understand this, so can you try and relay it to someone else? And he also displayed proper situational awareness by just making the decision to fly over the bay instead of LA, save hundreds to maybe potential thousands of lives. Because if he would have made the decision to fly over LA area and the aircraft went through a nosedive, could have killed a lot more people. So having that sound judgment really saved a lot more people given the deadly circumstances. So I just want to go over a couple of quotes real quick that I think are really important. So basically what I said earlier, I can't read your writing. Can you read her the zero fuel aid? So while they were relaying information, he couldn't read the first officer's handwriting, so he just communicated, hey, I can't read your handwriting, can you relay it over? Simple. And then the second one is, we tried everything together, we ran about every checklist that we can. Any hidden circuit breakers, we'd love to know about them. This is talking to maintenance to see if they can get the elevator unjammed. And then he said, we got it back under control here after the ATC, but first officer actually said we don't. And the captain was like, oh, yeah, never mind, we don't have it under control. So having that communication that, hey, the first officer reassured the captain that we don't have it under control. And the captain accepting it is really professional. And I thought that was awesome. And then he said later, yeah, we're in much worse shape now after trying to deploy the speed brakes and trying to do everything a second time, which caused the jack screw to disassemble. And then he also said, you want to try it or not, it's up to you, man. He was relaying to the first officer about, hey, it's up to you. He was empowering the first officer to make decisions, which I thought was pretty cool, and it makes a good leader. And that's part of a quote as a captain is part of your job is to be a leader and to empower your first officer, but not too much, obviously. And then this is like one of the last things he said seconds before the crash. He says, got to get it over again, at least upside down, we're flying. So they tried to invert the aircraft, as Cameron said. They were trying everything they can until impact. Unfortunately, with a jam stabilizer and the thing, the jack screw falling out of assembly, you're with no elevator, you're not going to be able to maintain safe flight. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Aiden to give a little more info about the first officer.
All right, so the first officer was Bill Tansky, 57, just over 8,000 total time. There must have been some sort of discrepancy or something on the NTSB report. It says 8,000 of those hours were on the MD-80, so I don't know where he built his time or anything like that. But he had a lot of experience on the aircraft. He had flown, a current and normal schedule prior to the accident, no time off or anything like that. And, there were multiple reports that both the captain and the FO had gotten enough rest and sleep and whatnot before the accident. So we know that really was not a cause of this accident. The captain and the FO were awarded a ALPA gold medal for their actions by unanimous vote. And this had only happened a handful of times back in 2000. So, okay, next slide. All right, so I thought that the FO and the captain worked really well together. Good CRM skills, and even maybe at the time where CRM may not have even been as prevalent, but I thought they did a good job of communicating with each other and working as a team. More traditional style cockpit, I thought. The captain was pretty much giving out commands and assigning tasks to the FO, and the FO was doing backup as needed. For the most part, I think the captain was flying. However, they did make sure to do some handoffs back and forth in order to relieve each other, especially because it was kind of physically demanding, especially towards the end there. I guess they were really having to pull back. I think it was like 140 pounds on the stick. So there was a lot of good teamwork there. As far as what the FO did, I think I think the captain probably it definitely was the leader throughout this flight. However, I didn't see anything that I thought the FO did wrong. Basically just following orders and doing what he could throughout. I didn't see a whole lot that went wrong there. No breaks in communication or anything like that for the most part. He did handle a lot on the radios, I thought. Mainly that conversation that Tyler had talked about where with the landing weight calculations with dispatch. And it was going to be an overweight landing, but didn't end up being a factor. Next slide. All right. Very cool and collected attitude throughout the flight, as I previously mentioned. However, I did notice one occasion with the dispatcher. They were trying to pressure them a little bit going into San Fran when they were looking at their option of going into LA, talking about how there was a lot of traffic and the flow was going to be an hour and a half. And there was a conversation with the captain and the FO, frustrated a little bit, and rightfully so, I thought. So, the FO is there to, kind of comfort the captain and whatnot. And, but, I think the captain also did a good job. He did mention, that it's going to be on his shoulders and stuff like that. So I think the FO just did a good job. He did his duty, showed up for work that day, and did the best he could. So overall, I thought he displayed good CRM, and the two worked well as a team. So next slide.
Well, some things that the crew did well. I think the first was that identifying that there was a serious problem, and they didn't get pressured by their company to continue to San Francisco. They kind of weighed all their options. Something that I noticed and what the captain said in the CVR script was, well, a lot of times it's windy and rainy and wet in San Francisco. It seems to me that a dry runway where the wind is usually right down the runway seems a little more reasonable. And after that, after having more conversations with their dispatch stuff, they ultimately chose to divert to LA. Another thing that I noticed too is what I think the crew handled well was they were trying to talk to the maintenance guy in LA, and they were trying to see if there's any other like possible things they could do to try and fix the problem or make the problem just make their situation a little more bearable. And then just throughout the whole flight, you can notice in the CVR recordings and transcript that the captain and FO were actively like talking to each other and showing some pretty good CRM. The captain was kind of taking taking inputs from his FO, trying to ask him questions, but also at the same time, the captain was being a pretty good leader. Some of the leadership qualities I kind of noticed from the captain was he's kind of a mix of being consensus and consultative. He would kind of tell the tell the FO kind of what to do, but he'd also take in the input. So it's kind of like when I think it was during the flight. FO asked if he should take off the speed brake, and the captain's like, "No, don't do that. That's just going to make it worse." And then another thing I really noticed in situational awareness was in this flight, you could see that the crew wasn't focused on like who the problem was. They're more focused on what. An example of this, I think, during the flight was when they also talked when they were talking to dispatch, and the captain said, "We're going to LAX. We're going to stay up here, burn a little more gas, get all of our ducks in a row." I think that's the captain was trying to was more focusing on trying to at least figure out what the problem was and try to make it a little better. All in all, like in a CRM environment, I think the captain FO showed very proficient in CRM. It's kind of unfortunate how this turned into a all fatal accident, but all in all, I think the crew tried their best and handled what they were given to the best of their abilities.
Overall, it's kind of hard to go over what the crew did wrong. I think listening to them talk to each other, and as well as like go over all the maintenance and other ATC outlets to go through, it's pretty hard to see what they did wrong. But also, hindsight's 2020. Looking at it now, there are some things that they could have done to kind of change the outcome. But some of the first points were, given the lack of the checklist to land immediately, the crew didn't not do anything wrong. The NTSB noted this in the recommendations, saying, given that there was a failure with the stabilizer, there wasn't a checklist for it. They basically were running through what they could do and how they could fix it, where as if there was a checklist, they would have known to do what they should do right away. If they would have chose to turn back immediately, they could have saved the flight. Also, looking at this, hindsight's 2020. Had they chose to turn back as soon as they knew there was a problem, they probably could have made it back. But as corporate pilots, there's always the question, can we make it? Can we make it on time? Can we always keep the flight going and fix it while we're at our destination? had the crew have completed situational awareness of what was happening to the stabilizer, they could have made the right callouts to maintenance, as well as made a better decision on their situation. Unless you're on the tail of the plane, you know, you're not going to be able to see that that jack screw was jammed. I don't think maintenance really knew that that was happening. Um, other than that, their whole situation, they knew that they had a bum stabilizer and they were trying to fix it the best they could. However, when the crew did try to fix the trims, moving them at both at the same time, freed the jack screw and pulled it free. This caused excessive elevator runaway. And at this point, there was no way of really saving the flight. This basically destroyed the stabilizer and caused them to go down. Also looking back, if the crew would have just flown the controllable aircraft, they could have made it rather than trying to fix something that they probably couldn't have fixed in the air. Had they just stayed with flying with 10 pounds of back pressure rather than 140, they could have been able to either fly it to their destination of San Francisco or LAX, or they could have easily turned around and gone back to their initial takeoff airport.
Alrighty, as a result of the investigation, the NTSB gave some recommendations. Of the 24 recommendations the NTSB gave from its report, only one of them was really directed toward flight crews. This kind of continues on with the theme of the crew really didn't do anything wrong as far as their actions go. One of the recommendations was given toward dispatch operations, and the remaining recommendations were directed toward maintenance operators and manufacturers for treatment and data collection regarding the jack screw and its assembly. So I'm not going to read the whole excerpt, but basically, if you were to translate the excerpt into English, flight control malfunctions should only be performed with applicable checklists and procedures to troubleshoot. This will essentially, you'll avoid making the problem worse. That's kind of what you can avoid. That way you can avoid accidentally, if it's a jack screw again, for instance, you're not gonna mess it up even more than it is. Don't attempt to use trim, so that way you can avoid runaway in the future if the trim system isn't operative. And then if checklist procedures don't work, go to the nearest suitable airport, just save the flight that way. That seems to be the best option there. And then for dispatch operators, I'm not going to read it again, but if you were to translate it, operations directives should provide dispatch with proper tools. So if you go back into the report there, it will show you that they asked for help, but they were unable to receive it. They just didn't get a response. So hopefully dispatch will have tools. That would mean essentially having someone on standby, a mechanic to answer questions, and stuff like that. And then dispatch should not instruct pilots to continue flights for company convenience if they're experiencing safety of flight issues. This will remove external pressures from the cockpit and hopefully remove barriers to communication between dispatch operations and the flight crew. So if you were to break it down from the NTSB recommendations, how might you apply this to a similar flight? The NTSB tells pilots to only stick to the checklist, so only do that. As a captain, you would direct the FO to the applicable procedures and then plan ahead. And as a first officer, you would do the procedures and then just make sure the captain knows what to do, or at least help them point them in the right direction if they're not necessarily going that way. And if the procedures don't work, contact dispatch. So that seems pretty obvious, but you want to expand the cockpit, get extra help in there if you can. So if dispatch complains about scheduling, just try and avoid the external pressures. And if there is a safety of flight issue, know that, per 91.3, it's your job to make sure that the safety of flight is there. So if dispatch complains about flow or something like that, know that that's not the issue at the moment. Hopefully they can get maintenance and technicians on hand and help assist. But if that doesn't work, just go to the nearest suitable airport, and that would solve your problem there. So here's a similar accident, or incident rather. So Northwest 85 had very similar symptoms, just in a different direction. They had a problem with their rudder, but they didn't necessarily know what was wrong with it. So they hand flew the aircraft, ran appropriate checklist procedures, and then they actually contacted via conference call their headquarters or maintenance headquarters, and they were unable to do anything. So they found that they kind of isolated the problem, tried to solve it, could not solve the problem, so that they diverted. And had Alaska 261 not happened, maybe they would have tried to fix it. Obviously, they had a couple advantages. So one of the advantages is 261 occurred before 85. So company policies and other airlines may have been rewritten to kind of follow along with the recommendations. They also had 4 pilots in the cockpit. This was a 747. So they had extra kind of brain power, so to speak. And they were also in less congested airspace. They're over the Bering Sea, I believe. And so they didn't necessarily have to contest with other aircraft at the time. Next slide. All right, so final concluding thoughts were the captain did everything as part of land the aircraft. He stuck with it. He continued to communicate. And even though there was a crash, and it seems the crew must have done something wrong, there wasn't necessarily anything for them to reference on the aircraft. So this is one of those things where you kind of have to learn from that accident and apply it to your own situations. ATC seemed to be more of or dispatch in this sense, seemed to be more of a distraction than help in some ways. So what you got to do is keep the external pressures out of the cockpit and just keep communication on the problem at hand. And then obviously future accidents may be prevented due to this accident from a mechanical and a CRM side, not necessarily in the cockpit, but between dispatch or operations and the pilots themselves. So.
And here are our sources. We used the NTSB accident report for Alaska 261, and we also used an air crash investigation video on YouTube that recreated basically everything that happened. It was really interesting, and it was awesome to see everything come together and input. Just want to say thank you for taking your time to listen, and I hope everything gets better during this pandemic. Thank you. Have a great night.